How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Today we're going to talk about and finish up our discussions on stress, PTSD. But today we're going to mostly talk about how management and our coworkers can add to the stress of what we do every day. And I have my great panel with me today. I have Greg Piper and Connie Alleyne. Greg, you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Not at all. My name is Greg Piper. I'm the Director of Training for Guardian RFID. I travel the country visiting with corrections professionals, implementing a software tracking system all throughout the country. I've been to probably 220 jails in the last 3.5 years. I'm on the road about 40 plus weeks every year. I had a little break during the pandemic, but I'm back at it again. Prior to that, I was deputy sheriff with the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a 500-bed jail. Before that, I spent 9.5 years with the Kansas Department of Corrections, starting as a line officer, worked my way up. I was unit team for a little while and ended as a captain over staff development. So I have about 15 years in corrections, and I think that I'm Tony's long-lost twin brother.
Older twin brother. Can I announce your age publicly?
Absolutely.
52 years old. And I'm telling you, he does not look like he's 52. You know what's really impressive? You start telling people that you're 63, you'll even look better.
Yeah. Well, you don't look bad for a guy who just turned 32. So good job, Tony.
Wow. Real age is 43, but I'll take it. Connie, how are you?
I'm good. So I'm Connie Alleyne. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I started my correctional journey on Rikers Island for 10 years as a prison health manager, and then at Connecticut Department of Corrections for another 5 years as a prison health services administrator. And now I am training civilian employees on how to have a safe and successful career in corrections. And I'm also having some fun with my students at Monroe College. I am a criminal justice professor there, training up the next generation of civilian employees. So I'm having tons of fun on Tier Talk, sharing everything that I've learned.
Well, we learn both ways, obviously. We learn from you as well. But I'm going to tell you something, guys. Thank you guys for coming. This was kind of last minute, but I wanted to do something to finish up our shows on PTSD. We did 3 great videos, but I want to go back to corrections one more time. So I started with William Young about corrections. Then we did something with police. Then we did another one, which was police and corrections. Now I want to finish off with corrections. And one of the things that people have been coming back was, Gangi, remember, it's not just the inmates. What about management and coworkers? So I said, you know what, let's get it up and running. And I called Greg and Connie, and they were ready to get the information out there. So I want you guys to know I appreciate that and your dedication to what we're doing. It's not even just about Tier Talk, guys. It's about getting the message out there, because you never know who needs it at that exact moment. So I appreciate you. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talk to you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell is going to notify you every time I post up a video. We're going to go to our sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about how our peers and management can add to the stress of working in corrections. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it. It's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, inmate manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems. Inmate manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description.
And we are back. Guys, I think this is a great topic. I know we all were on together the other day, and we had a chance to hear a story from Renice Bain about what happened to her husband who, died on the job. He was in a search and rescue, died in a helicopter crash. But one of the things I learned, again, I just want to bring it up one more time just to finish off this topic, is having that paperwork done. Making sure that paperwork is completed. So again, I just want to cover it one more time, maybe get a little input from our experts here. But Greg, I'll go with you first. How important is it to get that paperwork completed just in case something happens?
Well, I think it's really an overlooked piece of the puzzle. We do annual training every year. We go through all of the pieces. We take our sexual harassment training, all our different trainings that are required. But we need to make sure that one of those things that we do, that we are required to do, is sit down and make sure, do we have the right next of kin? Do we have the right spouse notification? Do we have the right, our children listed? Are all those pieces in place? Because unfortunately, it does change from time to time in corrections. And if we don't have the right pieces in place, our human resources directors, God love them, they do a great job, but they can't keep up with a staff of 200 or 300 individuals. So we need to do our part. We are responsible for that. So as a staff development coordinator, one of my jobs was to make sure everybody did make sure they got their pieces of paper done when they went through new employee orientation. But it's that repetitive each year, making sure it's accurate. It is critical so that we can notify the right folks down the line.
Right. And Connie, would you say that you have the same problems from the medical perspective with people not keeping up with that paperwork?
Absolutely. I mean, we go from, people get married and they don't change the people who should be a part of their benefits. Or when someone gets a divorce, they don't take that person off. When people give birth and they have children or they adopt and then they don't add the children, but then something happens, what we try to do is make it a part of the open enrollment process. So as we go to do open enrollment, we do a check to see if everyone's paperwork is in order. I mean, clearly we're not kind of pushing it down folks' throat because people still do have their own individual responsibility to stay on top of that. But it is part of that checklist process. Have you checked these things as well as you're going through and making your adjustments to your health insurance selections?
Right. And if you're management, what you definitely should do is definitely have some type of yearly chance where your immediate supervisors to that front line have to go around and update that paperwork, because it becomes a hassle where if there is an emergency, especially if someone's a no-call, no-show, where you have to track that individual down and turns out the address is wrong, the phone number is wrong. Yes, you're going to go after that employee, don't get me wrong, but the hassle of it all to try to find out who knows that individual and who has some updated information on them. I mean, we wind up having to break away from what HR has and says, oh, who hangs out with this guy? Anybody have any information? And it's a scramble, again, especially when it comes to that no call, no show as well. Hey guys, I thought I'd start off with Connie first. So we're going to discuss, again, sometimes how management causes a lot of stress, but also our peers as well. We're going to kind of try our best to cover the gamut. So basically, in short, for our profession, it's not always the inmates. Some cases I've had staff tell me the inmates are the least of our concerns because we expect a certain level of behavior from them that we're able to cope with. It's when management and peers do something that we wouldn't expect, especially when it comes to kind of reinforcing that bond that we're supposed to have, and you figure out that they wind up doing everything to kind of put a little strain on that bond. But let's start with management first. Connie, do you believe, even on the medical side of corrections, do you believe that there is a bit of a divide between management and frontline? And if so, why do you think that divide exists?
So I think for one, especially on the medical side, depending on if you're a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, or psychologist, there's that friction amongst them, right? Like, so whose discipline is the most important one in the space, and who should take priority, and all this other foolishness that really in the grand scheme of things makes no sense. But it still exists. And so when you have a point where someone thinks that their mental health diagnosis may supersede the medical diagnosis, or if in fact the medication regimen needs to be adjusted because the psychotropic meds outweigh the medical meds, or there's some contraindications there. Sometimes there's this clinical battle that happens. And then as the administrator, who's not a medical doctor, they kind of want to put us in the midst of that to help at least navigate the conversation, because sometimes egos and tensions and stuff get in the way of finding the most clinically appropriate treatment for the inmate. But what also happens is then you have the pressure from central office, because when you do have these kind of conflicts arise, usually the medical director or the psychiatric director has to come in and sort of manage that disciplinary team meeting to make sure that we are sort of hitting the mark where we need. Are we meeting the standard of care and community versus not? But what happens is the stress and the tension that builds, because now these physicians are at odds. They are pulling the nurses into these discussions or into the disagreements as well. It's almost like, playground, right? Everyone, I'm mad at you, and then people are picking sides. And so as administrator, you have to get in the middle of that, because that can actually erode any team cohesion that you have can be obliterated by just simple things like that. But the stress then comes because everyone gets tense when central office comes to the facility, right? It's like, why couldn't we handle this internally as opposed to bringing central office inside, who now has to be like the heavy in the conversation? And then it's that tension between central office and the direct and medical or mental health. Like, why am I here, right? Because are we looking for what's the clinically appropriate treatment, or are we actually looking to see who's willing to acquiesce, right? And really, it's like, is this what we need? This is not what we need. We don't need the stress of our peers. We don't need the stress of our colleagues. And these are technically the leaders, right? So you've got nursing looking up to the medical doctor, and nursing looking up to the psychiatrist. You've got the clinical team looking up to the psychiatrist. So you've got social workers, counselors, and such, looking at how these leaders are engaging. And so that in of itself creates more tension, because now you've got disciplines fighting against each other, which doesn't do anyone any service. So certainly you have a lot on the medical side that has to get navigated. Like we have to manage that so that, one, the patient doesn't end up getting sicker because we're battling over treatment. And two, we don't continue to pull staff into the infighting. That's just not a positive situation for them to be in.
You mentioned two great things during that as well. One was the blame game, and I'm sure Greg will dive into that a little bit before I go into it. And also the pressure that middle management has to face, because middle management gets it from up top and then also from down below, and they're caught up in the middle trying to be that person to translate both concerns. So, I mean, if you think about it, the person in middle management has to speak both languages. They have to speak the language of the front line, but they also have to speak the language of management, and they're the ones that have to translate both those levels of communication. It puts a lot of pressure on middle management. So when frontline feels that they get a lot of pressure, and then sometimes the upper management feels we're under a lot of pressure, I feel sorry for the middle management, who just kind of is the messenger between both parties. What's your thoughts on that, Greg?
Well, it's absolutely the case that oftentimes, and I'll just speak maybe to the officers in general, just the folks that are out there on the front lines every day. We'll just give them an example. What that means is, in my particular facility where I started first as an officer, we had officers, we had sergeants, staff sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. And the orders would roll down. The captain would tell us, the staff sergeants, hey, make this happen, make this a priority. They would chew our butts if things weren't right, if the living units didn't look correct, if things weren't happening, or if officers weren't doing their job. And then it's my job as a staff sergeant to take that chewing, and then turn around and try and encourage and coach my team underneath me, and not let all of that roll downhill into them. Now, when my subordinates, my officers, my floor guys want to complain and yell and bitch at me about what's going on in administration, I'm to take that, and then I respectfully take it up the chain of command and have to explain that to the captain and those above me. So it really is a tenuous spot. And that's the stress that begins to build, is that there's that tension in between those two. Because the things we're talking about, when we say situations that our peers and our coworkers can do to us, those are different, and people are thinking, well, what can they do? They can quit? No, we're talking about the things they do on a regular basis. What rounds are they not conducting? What things are they letting go in the living unit that I now have to deal with? What areas are they not doing their basic jobs that I have to pick up the stress of and the actual tasks of? So PTSD, as the term that everybody wants to use and throw around there, can be a traumatic incident. It can be a bomb explosion. It can be a riot. It can be a death in custody. But it can also be the constant everyday battle that we face on the hill, that we face on the line, and it's constantly beating us down. It's that wave washing over us until we don't even realize it's on top of us. But that stress is so heavy upon us like a cloak that we don't realize we are now in that traumatic stress-induced environment, and we don't even realize we're in it because we're constantly dealing with those uphill battles of up and down, up and down.
You know, you mentioned something great about, you know, really hitting those good employees with a lot of work. Like sometimes supervisors, they get very dependent on employees that do the job, and instead of them actually dealing with the employees that don't, they wind up overworking the ones that do. You know, because I become reliant on that person because I also am responsible for the final work effort. They don't realize that you could have a good employee that may be uncomfortable saying no, but you're overworking that individual to the point maybe that individual's getting stressed out because when they go to a certain area, they see, hey, everybody else is doing nothing, you know, and here I am, I'm doing everything. And, you know, you can only get by with that excuse as a supervisor. Yeah, but I know you're the person that get that job done. Yeah, but, you know, I still think it's kind of unfair that I'm the person being overworked and everybody else seems to be living life. I think at that point, you're not complimenting me anymore. It becomes very insulting. I also want to talk about when we have emergency situations. Now, this is more between frontline and higher level management, but when you deal with an emergency situation, I'll start with Greg first, and then obviously with Connie, because I'm sure both of you guys have dealt with many emergency situations. There's going to be a divide between management and frontline as to figure out if there's a problem, where the problem stems from. So it's sad because now instead of us having to be together, which we should be at this point, you know, we should find a way to defend the actions of the individuals that are involved. We're not, because management's going to be looking at, you know, is there something about the policy that failed? And, you know, looking at the individual saying, okay, well, maybe this person made a bad choice because the policy was good. And then you're going to have someone from the front line or the front line looking at like, hey, the policy was bad. It wasn't our individual. But what we should be doing is getting together and really communicating and understanding why certain choices were made that could have led to this emergency situation. But would you give out any advice, like for an emergency situation, how do we stay connected and not look to what Connie said, play the blame game? Because we all know that happens when an emergency situation occurs. Everybody's pointing fingers instead of everybody sitting together and really discussing what happened and basically get an understanding of what went wrong. So, Greg, you have anything about the divide that happens during emergency situations?
Yeah, I think it starts with understanding what section we're in. If we're in the middle of the crisis, obviously someone has to make the call. Someone has to make a decision. There has to be a decision tree. I know that those of us who've gone through National Incident Command courses know one person can delegate to seven, which can delegate to seven, and it breaks its way down. If you have a multi-jurisdictional event, you've got to make sure who's the head, who's making those command decisions. Now, when you're in the middle of it, if I'm down the tree a ways, and I know that one of those decisions may absolutely make the situation worse because I was involved in some other piece that they're not aware of, then I should send that up the tree as quickly as possible. Obviously, we want to listen to that one head. We have marching orders. We want to make sure we follow those commands so there's not chaos in the battlefield. But the other part of that is once we've relieved that chaotic moment, that emergency, the bleeding has stopped, wherever the case may be, we absolutely need to have a debriefing. There needs to be a team that gathers together those involved frontline right away at the beginning, those who were middle management that got involved, the upper management, and possibly an arbitrator, an outside source, whether that be if no one from medical was involved, that's a great person to bring in to say, okay, let's talk about everyone's involvement and how it can be better. Bring in somebody from another facility who's been through it. But you need to have a group debriefing involving all those levels to see who performed at what, and rather than point fingers and say, well, it's your fault. Even when Tony and I, who've done videos from situations at other facilities, we always like to say, hey, we're not trying to be a Monday morning quarterback. We're merely trying to find ways to train and improve so no one gets hurt and we all go home.
Yeah, I agree. The effort has to be constructive. Now, if you have higher level management, because I really do think it starts at the highest level, because they really do set the culture in which the front line winds up reflecting. If you have higher management, upper level management, putting pressure on that middle management, like, I don't want to know why, I just want people to get written up, I want people to get disciplined, then now that to me is what causes the divide. If you have higher level management that's willing to listen, then the frontline supervisor can maybe be a little bit more constructive in their methods, as opposed to being quick to write somebody up. Because the thing is going to be is, if they don't point the finger at somebody, then what happens is the supervisor is going to wind up taking the hit. And I believe it or not, there are a lot of supervisors that are willing to take a fall for their troops. Don't get me wrong. Or I'd say a lot of leaders, because they're reflective of the decisions of that front line. But there are some that aren't. And when that supervisor is put into a position where they have to cover their own ass, now there's going to be a divide, because now it's not constructive. Now the supervisor's out to write somebody to protect themselves, which ultimately is what that higher person's probably trying to do. They're trying to push discipline to protect themselves. So that reflects down, further down. And now you have the front lines like, hey, we're not going to be a scapegoat for your bad choices. Connie, I'm sure that you've dealt with this, correct? Especially in medical?
Absolutely. I mean, so I think this upper management, they really do a disservice by looking for someone to blame, because, you know, I've been through many after action reviews, right? So here are all the details regarding this particular incident. And so let's take an objective review of this incident so that we can come up with what are the corrective actions, not necessarily for the people, but corrective actions for the way we responded and the things that we did. Oftentimes, especially in emergency situations, people are dealing with whatever at the time. Like, that is what they can handle. This is what we know. I'm making those decisions based on what I know, and not necessarily after the fact, where we can all sit down with a cool mind, a cool head, and make very good judgments because there is no pressure. On the medical side, a lot of times we see this, particularly when we review codes. So I've sat with security division, I've sat with investigations, because maybe they felt there was something negligent done in a response to a code. And you look at the step-by-step, at which point I can sit there with the policy and check. Here are all the things you did. And then if that nurse or that doctor has missed something from that checklist of things, then they want us to focus in on that one thing. But if there's 100 things on the checklist to do, and you've done 99, I think that it's very harsh for us to be looking to take a significant action on the one thing out of the 99 things, out of the 100 things that person missed, in a stressful state of mind. And I think, you know, as managers, as leaders, we have to get better at giving people some sort of leeway, or you used your best judgment in the moment. And then how do we fix this? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? As opposed to, let's write this person up because there's some consequences for missing an hour.
Well, can you say your final thought again? I think you got broken up.
Oh, so I said, I think there's a point where we actually have to give folks leeway, because if you miss only 1 out of 100 on that checklist in a pressured situation, there should be some kudos given that you got all this stuff done, as opposed to looking at how are we going to, you know, punish this person, or what will that consequence be? Many times it could just be a matter of implementing something to help people remember whatever that last step is. I mean, we've done a lot to change what we put in emergency bags, for example. Like when the nurse is running to the code, the nurse may have all this stuff with her, but then what we found is, like, in the midst of the code, you forget, like, I should have brought this. So now you have an emergency bag that has all the stuff that you need, as opposed to, you know, depending on someone's memory in a pressure-filled situation. And I think the more that we do that is the more that we show staff that we're trying to be supportive of them, as opposed to trying to blame them for the things that they happen to forget in a tense situation.
You know, I love the fact that you brought that up, because even when we deal with inmate complaints, I mean, sometimes it happens where, you know, you may miss one. Don't get me wrong, it's still important, but it happens, we're human, and people will focus on the one and disregard the hundreds of thousands that you've answered. You know, same thing. Oh, go ahead, Greg.
So I think what you're both trying to say is, I did 99 things, but a check ain't one. is not a reason to fire a guy.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think Jay-Z said it best. But the thing is, it's true. They don't look at the context of it all. They just look at the immediate, what's in front of them. And that's because, again, they're quick to either cover their own ass, or maybe they don't know enough about the job. All they do is know that this person failed at this part, and they're not going to know the context of what that responsibilities is of that individual. Now, I noticed Greg was nodding his head a lot in regards to what you were saying with, 99 misses, or no, 99, getting the job done 99% of the time, but the checks aren't won. What was what were some of the things that you were agreeing with what Connie was saying?
Well, a few Tier Talks ago, I used a quote. We were talking about mentors and leadership, and I used a quote, and this falls right in line with what both of you are saying, is that it's a quote from a movie, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and it is, "Attitude reflects leadership, Captain." And so that attitude that's coming down is, if the leaders up above are so scared, they're just going to start firing off bullets to take out anybody who made a mistake, rather than focus on the big picture, retraining, and did the intent of the officer. Did we do everything we could? Maybe we missed some training. Maybe there's some pieces that we missed. Are there things that absolutely we need to eliminate staff for if they were absolutely negligent? Yes. But I would say in just about every critical situation I've been in, it's been a lack of training that has caused the problem, because we don't prepare these staff for these critical incidences. And so we are so worried about getting all these little things done. What about the big thing? When is that moment that we can prepare for that critical incident? How many codes do we run in preparation so it becomes second nature? So the attitude of the staff is a direct reflection of what's going on up above them.
Right, and I think that cover your ass mentality definitely affects with the morale and the stresses that add to the job. Because if you have management that doesn't look to be constructive, they don't care about why. All they care about is, I got to protect myself, whether this person made a wrong choice or not. Well, that's the wrong mentality that winds up only adding stress to the individuals that had to make a choice. That's one thing. Second thing is, it's going to make them hesitant later on when they have to make a choice, and definitely the divide. Because then front lines can easily see, like, you're going to let our people go for as a scapegoat when you knew, or it should be simple to you why that person made that choice. Again, if you have roots on that front line, you would be able to see the reason why someone's been able to or had to make that choice. Where if you've never been there, you're making choices, or you're reviewing choices that you're not fully aware of why those choices are made. And I think right now that cover your ass mentality, which seems to be practiced at a lot of places, is really killing the morale and just adds to stress. And again, Connie.
So, in line with that, I've had the experience of, central office staff who never worked in a facility before. And so when you have people who have never worked in a facility before, they can't understand what it means when you're responding to a code on the other side of the compound, carrying all the stuff that you need to carry with you. Maybe something dropped along the way. They don't, as much as as an administrator, I'm like, okay, I'm not running to codes, but I have to be present, right? But the reality is that you don't know what it feels like, but then you're making these decisions based on what you think or what the book says the response should be in this moment, as opposed to the real life, having this experience and understanding how this can go awry. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face when we have decision makers who haven't actually done the job, who have no idea what it is like or what it feels like to be working under pressure, to keep your hands steady, right, in the time of an emergency. To how do I make sure this tourniquet is on properly? Have I really done the right amount of compressions with breaths? It's all these things that over time becomes routine. But however, when you are in an emergency situation, it's not the easiest thing to do. And I feel like many times our senior leaders are kind of just disconnected from that.
Well said. And I'm actually going to touch on something here now with what you were saying, Connie. I want to talk about inmate suicides for a second. Again, not to minimize or negate other emergencies, but there's a reason why I want to bring up inmate suicides or inmate deaths in general. That could put a lot of stress on the officer that's in charge of that inmate, maybe the mental health person that could have missed something. There's a lot of stress there. Now, if we're quick to point blame at somebody, let's say during the death of an inmate, then what happens is that not only is this person carrying the weight of what just happened, because some people, I would like to think that death of anybody affects anybody. I'm sorry, it should. Even if it's an inmate, even if it's an inmate, it doesn't matter. Some of us hold the responsibility of our job to such high regard that the death of an inmate means we failed to do something, and we take the added pressure of that failure. And now if you have management that's looked to quickly say, not even why it happened, but I want that person written up, that adds to the stress that this person has to deal with. The death of the inmate that was just on his watch. And again, I'm choosing a suicide because I think this paints a better picture for us. But also, am I going to lose my job? Now, compound that stress, because you're not that officer or that staff member is not going to know anything for a while, because they're going to do investigations. They're going to do a bunch of stuff. And he's going to have to, or she's going to have to live with the unknown for weeks, maybe even months before they decide to say, okay, you know what? It was okay. We saw that you did your rounds. And even so, even if you have management that just looks to push the blame, you as frontline may be uncertain, even if you do your job and you're positive you did your job. Is that enough? Did I do enough? I did what policy said, but are they going to get me for something else? And that to me causes a lot of stress, because if management's not going to sit there and understand why, and they have a history of constantly writing people up. It's like getting in trouble in school, and every time the principal called me, your stomach hurt, because the only time I saw the principal was when I was in trouble. Well, same thing here. Management calls me. They're not calling me to, give me some type of recognition, maybe even a job well done for catching it within 10 minutes. I mean, how many times we do that? You have a suicide attempt, right? And let's say, the inmate's successful with the suicide, but you still make it within policy. You still make it within 5 or 10 minutes. That should be something that's noteworthy. Maybe something that's said to the rest of the staff saying, hey, even though this inmate unfortunately was successful with the suicide, we would like to make note that Piper and the help for medical with Connie, they did the best that they could, and we would like to give them a letter of recognition, because it's really about the effort. Did you put the effort? Regardless of the outcome, did you put the effort? Hey, Greg, what's your thoughts on what I'm saying?
I think you're 100% right, because the officer can be, I'll give a brief example. We had many years ago, we had an offender who was on constant observation because he had tried things, and he was clearly a mental health consumer. He was on constant observation, and the officer was staring through the food trap, beanhole, whatever you want to call it, watching him constantly, actually was talking to him briefly just to make sure there was some connection with him. And at one point, the inmate stood up to use the restroom, looked over at the officer, stood up on the toilet, locked his hands behind his back, and did a header off the toilet. There's nothing the officer could have done, because by the time he noticed it, ran to the door, got the door unlocked, it was too late. So we can do everything. Best efforts are always there. We can train and train and train. Be vigilant on our watches. Have conversations with the offenders. Watch for those telltale signs, and things are still going to happen. Staff needs to know your efforts are not in vain, because inmates who want to kill themselves truly are probably going to kill themselves. We can do everything we can, and we want to make sure we avoid it. We want to make sure we catch them if we can, but we can't go in with the idea that we're going to stop everybody. And we make our best efforts. We do our best job every day. And those in the top tier, those who are looking down, like Connie mentioned so beautifully, even though she's not responding immediately to every code, she's there. Can you notice what the effort was made, and that we need to let those folks know you did do your best, because they are making a concerted effort.
Connie had a story in the last video we did on PTSD, where there was a nurse that, even though the inmate had passed already, she's still doing the compressions on, the rigidness of his body, but the stress that this person must have went through. And then obviously, if there is a failure to bring that inmate back, is anybody telling that nurse, hey, just want to tell you, I know you went through a lot, but I just want to tell you that effort was greatly appreciated. You just didn't give up. You kept on fighting. Is anybody recognizing that on medical?
Yeah, so really that nurse needed so much support after. Like physically, she was physically exhausted. Her arms were just done. Her body was tense, everything. Then mentally, just the fact that she had known this patient, she had worked with this patient. Yes, inmate, patient, the way we refer to them, we know it matters. It's like this ongoing dialogue about how we refer. In the moment of providing care, that's her patient. And so as a nurse, her thought was, I just lost my patient. And I knew I was doing compressions that were no longer effective because the body had already gotten rigid. And so mentally, she was not in a good space. I actually called EAP on her behalf because I knew she wasn't in the mindset to be able to do it. I knew that we had critical incident come. And I think because it was a completed suicide, the first thing happens if people are like, okay, my last encounter, what was it well documented? The doctor's checking to make sure the medication list was up to date. Like everyone's double checking everything that they've done because they're expecting the blame to come at some point, regardless of the fact that we know we can't save everyone. And we know that if someone is intent about completing that suicide, they will have the right timing. They will make sure that their cellie is not anywhere around. She's already gone to school. They'll make sure it's in between the officer's tour. They will make sure that they're doing what they need to do and they're prepared to complete that suicide. And so I think when we think PTSD, we do have to think, what is the impact long-term to us having these experiences behind the wall, where you do have the suicides, where you are seeing people at their very, very worst. And as a service provider, you aren't able to bring them back. You aren't able to stabilize them. That's very difficult that's a difficult reality to deal with as a service provider.
Yeah, and before we wrap up with management and go to our peers, because the peer thing I saved for the end, because I'm going to mention something that may be a bit controversial, but this show, we're going to explore it. But I want one other thing. So we talked about the blame game, the need to cover your own ass, definitely puts pressure on the front line, but also front line not understanding what to expect from you. Inconsistency, or just not understanding the rules that you're setting forth. And inconsistent management definitely leads to staff that is stressed out, because without consistency, staff just doesn't know what to do. And we touched on this before, guys. We touched on inconsistent leadership. And hey, Greg, how do you think inconsistent leadership adds to the stress of the everyday job?
Well, I think I would liken it to you're the coach, the head coach of a football team, and halftime comes around, you're up 14-7, and you go into the locker room, and at halftime you decide to completely change the playbook and do something completely different in the second half. Now, I understand that strategy in the sense you want to catch the other team off guard, but these are your teammates. You wanted to let them know the game plan before the game even started. Don't start throwing out new plays and just start throwing out new game plans without letting your team know ahead of time. Practice those things, train those things. We train the way we fight, and we do that for a reason, because we're all on one team. And this is not working in an insurance office. This is not working at the Starbucks or Home Depot. No offense in those industries, but these are totally different. We take our lives into our hands, so we have to train to be prepared for the worst so we can make it the best. So we can't throw different plans out there all the time. Leaders, supervisors, and this is from a sergeant. It can be just your staff sergeant letting you know, your sergeant beginning the shift, hey, this is the game plan for today. This is what we want to accomplish. Let's go make this happen. Don't shift that unless something happens to create that change. But we want to be prepared and have a game plan long ahead of time.
Right, and I also think that consistency brings confidence. I think that when you're consistent, I think people start to see the actions and like, okay, this person really knows what they're doing. But now when you have management that's inconsistent, the confidence is just not shown by that front line. So you start having inmates question the ability for staff to do their job. And I know Connie has dealt with a lot of changes in her career. And I'm sure when you deal with management that's inconsistent, how it reflects on the front line is just basically front line just doesn't know what to do, which makes them lose confidence in themselves, but also the perceived confidence that they would get from a minimal the population.
Yeah, so I mean, like we did this show about inconsistency, and I firmly believe that inconsistency invites chaos. And when we can't clean things up so that people have clear understanding of what the next steps are, clear understanding of here is the expected behavior or the expected response of me in this situation, it really creates just this space where staff are just not confident in their performance. And that's the last thing that we need.
Okay, so first of all, I think we covered a good gamut of how management could add stress to the frontline employees. Unless you guys have something else you want to add before we move into the peers, I think we did a good enough job. I want to talk about something a little bit controversial, and I'll talk about how this plays into how peers could add pressure to a frontline employee. And I want to talk about what some people call the blue code, or the code of silence. But I'm not going to go to Greg to give me the definition of that, because we all know, what our definition may be. I want to go to a civilian's definition. So Connie, in your mind, what does that blue code or that code of silence mean to you?
In my mind, that code of silence is that you guys protect each other no matter what. The good, the bad, the ugly. You guys are brothers, sisters in the field, and no matter what the situation is, you guys are going to make sure that you protect each other, whether it's protection from management, protection from the inmates, but you make sure that whatever situation comes up, that you end up unscathed by it. That's my understanding.
No. Okay, so not saying if that's right or wrong, because I want to ask you another question, though, Connie. Why do you think we do it, though? Let's say for those that do it, because the important thing is, okay, we know that this behavior may exist, just like I'm sure it exists in a lot of different professions. It exists among family members. I mean, but why do you think we do that?
So I look at it as like a family tree, right? You guys go through weeks of academy training with each other. There's certain bonds that you're able to build with each other. And there's you have that shared experience. You have that thing that sort of brought you together and have you guys bonded, which civilians generally don't have with you guys or with each other, because we don't have that kind of training experience, and we don't get to really go through academy in that way that allows us to bond. And so I think of it more of like a family tree. Even if someone is your distant cousin, like they're still your blood, they're still your family, and you try your best to protect your family. And now there are situations where like you may need to turn your family in, but in those instances, I feel like there's a lot of debate and internal conflict and struggle to do that, because this is your family, distance or not. And so I feel it's kind of the same way that you guys have this brotherhood, sisterhood that you come into the industry with, and there's a way that you just simply want to protect each other. And if there are things that you guys are doing wrong, if someone comes forward, it probably took a lot to come forward, because it's almost a violation of that code.
Okay, so I'm looking for something in particular, and you're touching it. You're right there. I wonder if Greg will be able to see what I'm looking for, because the reason why I want to mention why is I can't sit there and tell you that it doesn't happen. And then when I had to do my arguments, because I've been on platforms with this and having to do my arguments, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, because it does, and I'm not going to lie, but I think people don't understand why it may happen. And you're touching it, Connie. You're touching it with that family mentality, and you're touching it with the conflict. But I'm looking for something else, though, and I don't know maybe if Greg has it.
Well, I'm assuming that if it's coming from you, Tony, there's no way I'll have it, but I'll give it my best shot. I think part of that mentality is if my brother and I, and this is going to be my brother who is on the beat with me, the guy who's working the tier with me. If we have a fight, he and I may go at it like cats and dogs. He and I maybe have a knockdown, drag out, screaming match, maybe even go to blows. But nobody else is allowed to do that. This is my coworker, and I will fight to the death my right to protect him, because he and I may not get along, or she and I may not get along. But there's an us against them mentality inside the walls, and we have to make sure that we protect each other. And sometimes that does blur the lines a little bit, like Connie mentioned. We want to make sure that we stay above reproach and not violate any ethics codes, but sometimes we'll protect our brothers and sisters at all costs because it is that blood is thicker than water. But at this point, the badge is thicker than anything else.
All right, so I want to add to that. So you guys are both right there. And once I say what it is, I want your thoughts on this. Especially, I'll start with Connie again, because I really want the civilian side to really see what I feel is what it is. And I've studied this, actually, so I'd like get your opinion. So basically, you're right about the academy reinforcing that level of closeness, right? So it is a family bond. They do that by actually promoting what Greg said, an us first them mentality. It is. It's you want to hate the instructors, so you guys as recruits build a stronger bond. And it's not something I promote behind the wall. I don't promote an us first them mentality with the inmates, only because you have people that are in roles that help the inmates, like, advocates or social services, stuff like that. So if I promote an us first them mentality behind the wall, it winds up pushing the civilians away, the ones that are in that prescribed helping role. But with that said, I went through this situation where I had to turn somebody in. And it wasn't that I wanted to protect the wrong. I just didn't want to be a social outcast. I didn't want to have to come to work having people hate me, having people, not support me. And what happened was, it only took one person to stand up and say that what I was doing was right. That motivated me to continue on the mission. But the reason why I'm covering this is because I remember the stress. I remember having to go to work and everybody kind of isolating me, but then eventually they all come around. But it didn't matter about the ones that came around later. It mattered what motivated me at that moment to do the right thing. So my biggest fear was, if I step forward, I'm no longer part of that family. It has nothing to do with me, or perceived as part of the family. It has nothing to do with me wanting to protect what this person did was wrong. It's really about me surviving. How do I survive in this profession? So Connie, what's your thoughts on when I say that about being a social outcast?
I mean, so that's a big deal, and I don't think that's just custody. I think, so part of the civilian identity is that oftentimes we walk in and we feel like we're an outcast because we aren't part of custody, right? We aren't officers. And so the civilian experience in some facilities, you don't experience that culture that actually embraces civilians as part of the team. We are part of the them, not part of the us. And so I could see almost that survival mode that you go into when you are going to be kind of kicked out of the family. Because what does that feel like when you are no longer part of the family, where your buddies that you would talk to or maybe go grab drinks with after work are no longer interested in that level of camaraderie with you anymore because you have now violated the code. I mean, I've seen that on the medical side where, you've got a nurse that might not be doing the right thing, and her colleagues see she's not doing the right thing. She doesn't want her to get fired because they're all part of this union. And, the union says we don't jeopardize each other's livelihood. That's one of the first things that they talk about from the union perspective. So you got a nurse who wants to now come in. Like, I've had nurses come into me and like, Connie, can you just go check the log? Right? I don't necessarily want to tell on this person because I don't want to be the reason why, but this person's doing something that's going to jeopardize all of us. Can you go check the log? And so I've had that experience where I could understand, the nurse trying to protect the other nurse, but I also can understand that if in fact this is going to put us in jeopardy long term, the nurse is saying, I know I want to feel good with myself that I've actually taken action based on what I've seen. But I have to remind staff all the time that even though this is, you may not want to get your partner in trouble, the reality is that if you come to me, it's not a secret, right? If you come to me and you've now involved me in any way in this conversation, now when I go back and I go review the log and I see the discrepancies, I can now ask openly, hey, I found this in the log. Can some of you guys come and talk to me about it, right? I don't want to throw this nurse under the bus because I don't want her to have that outsider feeling that the other nurses may start treating her that way because she's now brought this thing to my attention. So like, I totally get it. And I get that there's a way folks just kind of want to keep their heads down and not be the outcast.
I think Connie, what you and Tony both mentioned is the difference between being a blue falcon and doing the right thing. because there is a fine line that we cross, because a lot of us just do want to keep our head down, want to make sure everybody goes home safe. We're just going to move forward. Hey, we missed that round, just moving along. But sometimes you have to do the right thing. You have to say something without necessarily wanting to be, that term that I used before was called a blue falcon. You don't want to be that guy, but at the same time, you still want to be the one, because we're ultimately trying to protect the honor of the badge. That's the most important thing.
Right. And I also want to mention, and by the way, Greg, I agree with that. I mean, obviously there is that that level of protection. I don't want to get myself caught up in something either. So I think there is that other part of survival. But I want to mention something. When we're talking about this, we're talking about, it's not something that you can kind of have a discussion with your partner for. This is something that is extreme, like an assault on an inmate or doing something that could lead to medical malpractice, whatever the case may be, So you're kind of put in a situation where you have to do something, because if you don't do it, then you yourself are going to be caught up into the mix. And a lot of people will think, oh, well, you only did that to cover yourself. And it's like, could be. But at the end of the day is that person brought me into that world. I just didn't voluntarily decide I'm going to wake up one day and, snitch on my peers. It just happened to be something happened. And now I got brought in. So if you had any respect for me from the get-go, you wouldn't have brought me into that world where that became an option for me. Okay, Connie.
But now that you've brought me in, deliberate indifference comes into play, right? And then complicit, you can't be complicit, right? And so we do have obligations within those terms to come forward. And so I'm personally not going to be indifferent to someone who's brought me some information, because I understand what the greater implications are to that information. And I think that as we think about our colleagues or our coworkers, they put us in those situations. And I think we need to be able to acknowledge that. That is not you're just out there trying to gather information and snitch on people. That's not where we're coming from. And I want the audience to be aware of that as well. This is, I cannot be indifferent to something that can now present a security risk. And there's no way that I can just turn my head and act like I don't know that the logbook was falsified, or that I don't know that, we've got missing sharps. I simply can't do that.
Right. And I have actually another scenario I want to run by Greg as well. Something I know that happened to someone I know. And basically, there was an officer that was getting assaulted right in front of them. But mind you, the officer was getting assaulted in a secure dorm. And the officer that was outside the secure dorm did have the keys to go into the secure dorm to try to help. But they can't, because they had to wait for response. Because at that point, they jeopardized the response team. So they have to wait for the response team to come in. And it was horrible, because this officer literally had to watch his partner get beat up. But there was, again, nothing that this officer could do, because policy forbade him, or her, but it's a him, to go into that dorm without that response team. So the officer's literally getting beat up right in front of him, but he couldn't respond. So at the end, when it was all said and done, his peers ripped into him, saying, I don't care what policy says. You should have jumped in there and you should have saved them and you should have did this and that. But having said that, there would have been a chance that if he would have did that, it would have jeopardized the next area and also jeopardized the response team for having to come in and get right into where the issue was. So this officer got tormented by his peers for following policy, and there was just no way that he could explain himself out of that, because everybody that wasn't in his shoes was saying, what you did was wrong. You should have jumped in and helped him. What's your thoughts on that, Greg?
Well, we've all dealt with this, whether it was firsthand or as a training exercise, because this is one of those unwinnable situations. I can tell you all day long, the right thing to do is to wait for backup. And I can tell you that I have been that guy who went ahead and breached that door. I've done that. I've been on both sides of this. Do I regret breaching the door? Yeah, it was absolutely the wrong thing to do, because I know that when I take that oath, when all of my brothers and sisters that put on that uniform, we all talk about, at least I did with my academy group and every academy group I taught, that you understand that it is not the wrong thing to do. And when you step inside those walls, you might have to fend for yourself for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, minute and a half. You might be on your own, but you're not on your own, because you took an oath to protect the civilian population outside these walls. And you have to know you're going to have to fight for yourself once in a while. So the right thing to do is, if you know there's another officer who is getting the heat for not stepping into that, we've got to step up and protect that officer and say they did the right thing, because not only did they protect that themselves, they protected every one of us, because it could have been a trap. Now I got 2 officers in there, just like in a video Tony and I did a couple of weeks ago. I had 3 officers down, trapped in an area, because the next 2 in decided they want to be a hero and save that one, when the right thing to do was to look at the big picture. We are not individuals. We are a team. And sometimes I'm going to lose the little toe. I'm going to lose the pinky or the ring finger in the process. Thank God an officer didn't die in this, but I'm going to have to sacrifice for the greater good. It's a fact.
Yeah, and I think that for the peers that would pass judgment, thinking that you know what that officer was thinking without actually talking to that officer, really understanding policy, I think you're adding to the stress of what that officer has to deal with, on top of the fact that the officer was actually helpless. And you're not giving them a chance to process what they just saw. You're not giving them a chance to understand within themselves why they couldn't respond. Because, again, that officer probably wanted to respond, but couldn't. And now all we're doing is just adding to the stress without giving that officer a chance to tell the officer what you did was right. If you would have went in there, you would have compromised the rest of the facility, but most importantly, compromised the chance to protect the individual. So I think here, just sometimes we don't see the pressure that we add to our peers when we're forcing them to, one, do something or be involved in something that is technically something they shouldn't be involved with to begin with, or not understanding some of the choices that our own peers have to make. And sometimes the union, if there is a union, you know, they may stress the fact that you don't turn on your own, but sometimes they got to realize something. And I mean, saying turn on your own, I mean, to me, that's a little bit extreme, especially if someone's doing something wrong. I think once the person did something wrong, they're no longer part of the family, in my opinion. So to sit there and say that you don't turn on your own when that's the person that already committed to the bad action, what you're going to wind up doing is you're going to now kill the morale of that person who is a good officer who happened to get caught up in a really shitty situation. And I know right now, as we do this show, there are going to be a lot of people that say, Gangi, I'm going to tell you something. I relate to that. I do my job. I do what's expected of me. And I had a great career. And then there was one moment when I was involved in a situation that I was brought into, and no one cared about what my career was like before that. All they cared about was that one moment. What's your thoughts on that, Connie?
So the one thing, as you were talking, I was thinking about is, you know, one of the effects of PTSD is hypervigilance. And, you know, you have people who were all working in this environment and have experienced these vicarious traumas and these different experiences that could lead to PTS. Thank you, Cody, for that. Lead to PTS. And so when you have a team of folks who have now become hypervigilant, I think there has to be some understanding, if you will, that even though some folks may be jumping on the bandwagon, their hypervigilance may not allow them to follow the policy, right? Like they are now impacted, or they have been impacted by their career in the industry. And that too can play into that. I couldn't resist going in to help. That hypervigilance is there because of what I've experienced in my past working in this environment, or I know what it feels like to have been that guy, right? So I couldn't just stand outside because I was that guy that was getting kicked and beat and all that other stuff. So I think there's understanding on both sides that have to be considered as we talk about these events that happen and how they truly do impact everybody.
Yeah, and the key to everything that we've been discussing, I mean, even just through the course of the Tier Talk lifespan, is just really communication and understanding. Obviously, to me, communication and understanding could alleviate all, or pretty much 99% of all the problems that we have. But unfortunately, for some reason, we have people that are still resistant for that open dialogue to be constructive. But in closing, guys, again, just more with the peers, Greg, showing support for someone that has to make a difficult choice, because deep down inside, those choices we could be involved in that one day, no different than that person is, and they really just become a victim of the situation. And it's not like they volunteer to step up and do something. It's just they happen to be in a situation that forces them to do something. So I think at that point, that support really does matter, because if that support's not there, there's added trauma to what that officer is going to do. And I know for a fact there have been some officers that have done great their whole career, some staff members that have done great their whole career, and wind up being a victim of circumstance where no one shows them support, and instead of them making a decision to be an outcast, they take their own lives.
Yeah, as a family survivor of suicide, I can tell you that suicide's no joke, and it is absolutely one of the more underrated killers out there. The signs are all there. I mean, once you look back, and that's always the case, we look back after something like that happens, it goes, oh yeah, they did this, and they did this, and they did this, they laid the signs. So, you know, as just an offshoot, I don't want to go down that rabbit trail, but it's a huge deal. And so that reaching out and making sure your coworkers are okay and have that voice to be heard is critical, because you can have an officer who does something on your team that you never expected, and you have to do the right thing. I had a coworker who, for some reason, I don't know, he was in my academy class, he was on the SWORD team, everything was going great, and next thing I know, he's being walked out because he started smuggling in tobacco for the inmates. Don't know what happened, don't know why. 3 months later, we had another officer on my basic team that got let out in handcuffs because she started an inappropriate relation with a staff member. You know, these things happen, and when we discover them, we have to come forward right away and get them off our plate, because by not speaking the truth and not speaking truth to power, we're going to have that constant stress on our neck, and we're going to go home at night thinking, man, this is just adding to the burden, and this is just another thing going on, and it just continues to weigh us down. But it's critical that, you know, like Tony just mentioned so beautifully, if we don't have respect and communication as the top two things coming out of our mouth when we talk about corrections, then we're not talking about the same field.
Right, and I want to add something as we come to a close now, before we have our closing thoughts, is that we are part of this family, and we have to show support even through the, you know, the darkest of times. If you have people that want to do the right thing, we should motivate them to do the right thing, and not be someone who pushes them down the wrong path, because at the end, these choices that we make, they're very difficult. And you have people here, medical profession, law enforcement in general, corrections. People may say, well, you could just quit the profession if it's that much bothering you, if there's that much conflict. And no, not if you've tied your identity to this profession. People that enter the profession of law enforcement or medical, they have something in them that wants to help. It goes beyond just the prescribed role. They identify with this. So when they feel that they lose out on this, or they're not supported in any way, they lose out on a sense of that identity in which they feel that they can never get back. And if we don't support them through some of these difficult choices, and all we do is stand against them and just kind of push them further and further away, the problem is they're going to make a choice. And the choice is something that we all are responsible for. And that's sad to say, because, you know, I've seen it. You know, I know people that dealt with it. So again, and Greg's been a survivor of you know, someone that he knows that committed suicide. So again, if you don't show support during these tough times, you wind up losing somebody that could have been a real good benefit. I mean, I'm not talking about just the family, but I'm talking about just for the profession as well. We lose good people because they get caught up in shitty situations, and nobody supports them when they have to step up and do the right thing. Connie, what's your final thoughts?
I would just say that we need to just be aware that PTSD is real. There are many physical health problems that are associated with it, from just body pain to diabetes, obesity, difficulty sleeping, headaches, fatigue, heart problems. You're at higher risk for them, respiratory problems, sexual dysfunction. I mean, the list goes on and on. You know, digestive disorder. Greg is over there making faces. Digestive disorders, indigestion. I mean, we poo-poo heartburn, but those are one of the side effects of PTSD, anxiety, hypervigilance. I mean, the list grows. And from your brain functioning perspective, just remember that the brain is storing the sights, the sounds, and the smells that are associated with events. And if you don't get professional support to help you work through those events, those sights, those sounds, those smells will always be with you. It's kind of like you have that reoccurring dream, right? Why won't this dream go away? Because you have to deal with it. And as much as we're supposed to be so strong and we go in and we ignore and we can disconnect our reality is that the brain doesn't do that. We can suppress it for only a period of time, but at some point it will come back and you will need to deal with it.
Well said, Connie. We mentioned in one of the episodes before that, escaping is a process. It's not about, automatically knowing that this is the solution. It's about a process, and it takes courage to face it. It really does. It takes courage to admit that you have a concern that needs to be addressed. And I think most of the people right here need to know that if you know someone's going through something, the key is not about giving them the answer, but to show them that you support them and that you're there wherever they have to go. Hey, Greg, what's your thoughts?
Well, Connie mentioned many things that I absolutely, can still feel to this day. I've been out of the off the tiers for 3+ years now, working in the private sector, but I still am nose blind. I can walk into somebody's house or an environment. I don't smell all that stuff anymore because you're so accustomed to a certain smell and a certain odor that transpires through jails that you become nose blind to certain odors. But then there are other smells that absolutely trigger me and pull me in. Visions, images, things that happen. I recently had a serious medical condition, and it was a direct reflection of the amount of stress that I had taken over the many years. I recovered from it well, and the doctors and nurses that helped me through that, we explained how those things transpired in my life, and it has given me a newfound attachment to helping these staff realize, take the precautions now. I know we only go through our PT, when you first join the academy, and then you don't worry about staying in shape anymore. And that's a huge mistake. Taking care of ourselves mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, those are critical. And PTSD creeps up on you, or it can happen immediately. Either one, both are ridiculously important in our lives. We can't afford to lose one single person in uniform. And by uniform, I mean everybody that walks inside the walls. I'm talking about civilians. I'm talking about volunteers. Every one of us who works with corrections, we need everybody. So this is a serious, serious topic. And it can't just be, hey, we're going to think about it in May. We got to think about it all year long. So please, if you have any issues, concerns, comments, questions, you're not sure at all what's going on in your life, you're feeling like you're neglectful, you reach out to your chaplain, reach out to your ESP, reach out to your medical team, reach out to your warden, reach out to Tony, reach out to Connie, reach out to me. My phone is on 24 hours a day. I may not know you, but I absolutely know everybody on this panel is in agreement when I say, if you need somebody to talk to, we may not know you, but you're still in our family, and we're going to be here for you.
Well said, Greg. I think that this kind of brought up a good ending. We started off with corrections, then went off into police, medical, and then back to the corrections realm, again, which includes corrections, medical, just the overall circle. And I think that me and William Young started off a great dialogue that we kept throughout the week, and we really covered a lot, and a couple episodes before, we even covered resources. This was just more about letting people know that we're familiar with the issues that you may have, even though you're not admitting to it. I mean, that's the key here. The key here is to bring dialogue out. So if you're going through something, you can say, wow, I guess I'm not the only one. And that's why we have these dialogues, just to remind you that, hey, guess what? You're not alone. You're not alone. And again, we're here. We're very accessible. We pretty much, anybody calls us, we pick up, like Greg says, Connie as well. So, it's just a pleasure, being able to have a community that supports each other like this. Now, as always, guys, I'm going to do the ending. I'm not going to hold Connie to it, because Connie was able to come on last minute. So I'll go ahead and step up the work that she's responsible for. All right, guys, as always, the show is here. So if you have it, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. The bell's going to notify every time I post a video, and stay safe.